So welcome back, everybody. I am here with Mr. Ed Morrissey of Hot Air, and it's very good to speak to you today, Ed.
Good morning. Great to speak to you.
So I believe you're particularly interested in the potential overturning of Roe v. Wade, which we heard about just recently. And, you know, anybody who's invested in the issue of abortion, whether they be pro-life or pro-choice, has been set on fire by this news and is very animated. But here in Ireland, I think there's a lot of people who aren't maybe too familiar with Roe v. Wade or what it actually is. So could you maybe give our audience sort of a brief explanation of the background of this ruling?
Sure. Well, first off, Roe v. Wade is a court ruling from 49 years ago that discovered in our federal constitution a right to an abortion that has no basis in its text. They sort of derived it from the Fourth Amendment, which allows people to resist searches without warrants, claiming that there's a privacy right embedded in that, and that abortion is part of the privacy right. So it was a convoluted ruling, and what it did was it took the issue away from the states. The states here have their own legislatures, they make their own laws, and each state is a little different because each state's population is a little different. So when the Supreme Court did this 49 years ago, they sort of erased all of that. And a follow-up decision in 1992 called Planned Parenthood versus Casey, we just usually call it Casey, expanded that constitutional right to an abortion to a point called viability, which is still not really well defined. And ever since then, of course, that has made it more difficult for states to regulate abortion. And there have been a number of court challenges to both of these decisions over the last few decades. The decision, as it looks like it's coming down, because this is just a leaked draft, we still don't really have a decision on this yet, in this latest case called Dobbs, would basically vacate the Roe decision, it would vacate the Casey decision, and it would bring the issue back to the state legislatures. And so it won't actually ban abortion per se, but it will allow states to pass their own laws about it if the decision comes down in the way that the leaked draft showed.
Now, what's so interesting to me about this is the fact that, as you say, Roe v. Wade is a 49-year-old decision. This is ancient history, you know, in when you think about it. It's become so cemented in the American political system. And yet now, all of a sudden, we're hearing that it might be overturned. Why do you think this is happening now as opposed to 5 years ago or 10 years ago or at any other point during the last 50-odd years?
Sure. Well, I'm 59 years old, so I'm not sure I'd call it ancient. But other than that, no, you're absolutely right. I'm obviously just having some fun, but you're absolutely right. It is a long-standing precedent. The Supreme Court has overturned precedents that have gone back farther. And I could give you a couple of examples, but it'd probably be mostly boring talk. The reason why it's happening right now, though, is because the composition of the court has changed over the last several years. There are more conservative jurists. These conservative jurists are more likely to restrict the court's interpretation of constitutional issues to just the text of the Constitution itself. And if you read the draft, it's a very lengthy draft. It's 98 pages. It's scanned rather than, so you have to deal with the image stuff and all that. But if you do take the time to read through Alito's draft on this, it makes it very clear that how the court reached that decision in Roe was an illegitimate use of the court, that it was legislation rather than judicial action. And they want to reverse that and end the court's tradition that has built up over the last 80 or so years of legislating from the bench, it's sort of shorthand for us saying that they're going beyond their constitutional bounds to try to decide policy. And Justice Samuel Alito is saying that's illegitimate. The court never should have done it in the first place. And that's the reason why we're vacating it now.
Because that's the interesting thing about the American system, is that obviously it's a beautiful system in theory with all the checks and balances, that all the branches of government are there and they're supposed to kind of keep each other in line. But it really does seem like the courts in particular have sort of run away with themselves in, I don't know when exactly that happened. I'm not an expert on US history, but that at some stage along the line, things seem to have gone somewhat awry there. Now, if you could tell us a little bit about the pro-choice reaction to this news, because we've been seeing crazy things on social media of, rioting and churches being attacked and all this sort of thing. And it just seems like things are really getting hectic over there. What's the reaction been like on the ground?
Yeah, well, we Americans are really known for our composure and our calmness in crisis, right? So we've had a couple of years of this type of behavior anyway, so I'm not terribly surprised with temper tantrums on this. And I'm not even necessarily going to assign that quality to one side or the other side. It just happens to be, in this side, the losing side happens to be the pro-choice, pro-abortion side. It's actually not been as bad as I thought it would be. I think it might get worse, but I'm not sure about that either, because in truth, the American public is not on the extremes on either extreme of the abortion question. The support for outright banning abortion across the board in any circumstance is very low. The support for abortion on demand until the day of birth is also very low. Where most Americans are in the middle someplace, which is a reason why this really should be decided by legislatures. And there's various polling that you can look at this, but what is very clear is that a large majority of Americans would support abortion through about the first trimester with some restrictions, and then a large majority after that would probably oppose it with some exceptions. And that's the reason why I think all of the protest, all of the demagoguery that we're seeing in the few days since the leak really aren't going to resonate with the American public when it comes down to actually settling this question.
That's one of the things that I've heard pointed out about this, that if this does come to pass as it's currently laid out, it's not like you won't be able to get an abortion in California or New York or any of the kind of liberal strongholds. It'll just go back to the states. Ironically, we had a referendum a couple of years ago to repeal the 8th Amendment from our Constitution, which enshrined the right to life of the unborn, and that was removed. And all that did was it allowed the government to legislate for abortion. Now, that was a catastrophe for pro-lifers, and if you believe in the right to life, that's not a good outcome. But it's ironic that America is just kind of going to end up in the position that we are now in, and it's seen as like this great win for the pro-life cause and this catastrophe for the pro-choice cause. And there's something very it shows you how far down the road of liberalism in this issue America has been for so many decades. I've seen evidence that there are some individuals who appear to be wanting to threaten the Supreme Court justices who are making these decisions. I believe their addresses were leaked online, and there have been demonstrations outside their homes and this type of thing. Is that going on, and what do you think of that?
Yes, it is going on. It's definitely going on. It's actually against the law in the United States to demonstrate outside of a federal judge's house. There's an actual criminal statute that prohibits it, and so far this administration has been very reluctant to enforce that for whatever reasons you can imagine. But it is actually going on, and I think, Ben, what it says is it demonstrates how warped the system got because of Roe. This is a situation where you've got people who are essentially lobbying judges for judicial decisions, which is completely illegitimate. If people need to lobby on behalf of a public policy, it should be to legislators, or for that matter, presidents and governors as well, elected officials who are dealing with the creation and implementation of public policy. That is not what the role of the judiciary is. The role of the judiciary is to look at the law, look at the facts, and to reach a ruling that doesn't have anything to do with public opinion. And so I think that these demonstrations, in their way, sort of prove Justice Alito's point in his draft, which is that Roe and its succeeding decisions and other such decisions, and you were right, this goes back maybe about a century, this trend towards judicial legislation, has really warped the role of the court and has warped the view of the court. And the only way really back from that is to get the court focused back on what its core mission is, and to leave policymaking outside of what's textually in our Constitution to Congress and to the state legislatures.
I heard Justice Thomas was very adamant that these protests are not going to deter the court, and that, he, for one, intends to stick to what he believes the Constitution says and so on. Do you think that these efforts will actually work? Could it sway and be effective in changing the outcome of this ruling?
I don't think so. I think that, first off, I think everybody understood that a ruling like this in Dobbs was going to generate this kind of reaction. Just, it wasn't clear when it was going to happen, because we needed to know when the decision would be released. But I think that they baked into the cake the fact that people were going to have this sort of massive emotional reaction. And then it would probably, settle out when people took it back to Congress. People took it back to their state legislatures, which is exactly what should happen. So no, I don't think it's actually going to work. I don't think it actually has worked. My guess is that, if anything, it's probably frozen the court in place on this. The rumors are, because there's a bunch of leaks now coming out of the Supreme Court, which is unfortunate, but the rumor is that it's a 5-3 split with Justice Roberts somewhere in between, the Chief Justice somewhere in between. And I think you're going to see, in the end, either a 5-4 or a 5-3-1 decision that comes out of this that overturns Roe and overturns Casey.
One of the things that I find most interesting about this is that, it's no secret, anybody who's been paying attention to politics is fully aware that the left has won an enormous amount of cultural and political ground in recent decades, and that I think there's an attitude among conservatives that once the left wins in a particular area, on a social issue in particular, it's basically done. We can forget about that. Now we have to just stop them from gaining any more ground. That's sort of the mindset, I think. Do you think that incidents like this will embolden conservatives to think, no, actually, we can go back, we can undo the damage that's been done to the culture, and kind of start pushing back on some of these issues like abortion and whatever else, that there is the potential for forward mobility here, as opposed to always being on the defensive?
I hope so, because I think that that's true. I think if you make your case well in the court of public opinion, and people, I would say, suffer the consequences of these cultural revolution type of policies from the left, then yes, I think you can make a lot of progress. And I would point to one in particular, which is the defund the police movement that erupted in 2020 after the death of George Floyd at the hands of police in Minneapolis, which is where I was living at the time. And it became very popular. It became tied up in American politics. All sorts of different progressive politicians adopted this as a rallying cry. And as a result, police were had their funding reduced, had their resources reduced. Crime shot up, though, as a result, and it's still high. Violent crime is still high. Property crime is just off the charts right now in the United States. We're back to where we were at maybe in the 1970s in terms of crime, and voters are sick to death of it. And I think that conservatives have been pushing back against this all along. I think that they have been vindicated in that pushback. And that's another area that I think is a lot more immediate than what's going on with Roe. But when you have a good policy in terms of policing that we had in place, and it gets changed on the basis of identity politics and the passions of the moment, you can push back against that by simply pointing out the facts and pointing out the outcomes of those. And the outcomes of that one is terrible. The outcome of Roe v. Wade, of course, is horrendous. 63 million abortions and counting still. But eventually you can win those arguments. You just have to keep fighting.
I guess at the end of the day, a policy either works or it doesn't, that one of us has to be right here. If you're for it and we're against it, that there has to be an outcome. One of us is going to be borne out eventually. Final question. I don't want to take up too much of your time. What do you think this ruling, if it pans out the way it seems to be, what do you think it will do to the pro-life movement, not just in America, but globally?
Well, first off, I think it'll boost it globally, because I think it's a big win for the pro-life movement. I do think, though, that this is not the end of the fight by any means. It's just going to move into legislatures, which is where it belonged all along. And so Now, both sides are going to have to convince voters of what the policy should be. When you get legislators elected in state legislatures, they're going to have to come to grips with there's a muddy middle here that they're going to have to somehow represent, because if both parties stay on the extremes of this, they're going to lose the voters. They're going to lose the majority of voters that will vote on this issue. So I think what people are going to expect is some sort of reasonable compromise on this. That is probably going to, I would say, eventually, if you wait long enough, it's a few years, it'll probably look a lot like what you have in Europe right now.
So you think that for the midterms and other elections that are upcoming in the next couple of years, we're going to see abortion as a much more pronounced topic that's discussed in the run-up to these votes?
I don't know if that's going to be true in this one, because inflation is so bad, crime is so bad. We've got shortages here in the U.S. I don't know if you've heard about the baby formula shortage, but we've got a massive baby formula shortage that's just really very dangerous for parents of infants and babies. Those are the issues. Those are the everyday issues.
Potentially World War III could be looking at in the next couple of months. So I'd say that might take.
Not to mention.
Yeah, I'd say that might take precedence over a lot of other things that you might be worried under other circumstances. But certainly, well, fantastic, Ed. It was really good to speak to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ben.